Why does fuel cost so much more in Canada? I mean, Canada is a huge oil producing country with a relatively small population. Despite having a high oil production cost, we still see relatively low oil prices. However, fuel is still hovering at levels only 20 cents lower than we've seen 2 to 3 years ago when oil was at $100 a barrel. With oil at $50 a barrel, for such a long time and the lack of any recent spike in the consumption of oil, what is to blame for fuel prices being as high as they are, despite the price of oil being cut nearly in half in the same time? Well, we need to learn how oil is bought and sold on the oil markets, and exactly the relation between the price of fuel and the price of oil. You see, most oil is traded much like any other commodity like meat, wood, and raw materials. But the oil market is graded much more like the coffee market than any other. You see, there's many different types of oil: sweet crude, light crude, sweet light crude, medium light crude, Dubai crude, etc. All of these essentially describe the properties of the crude as well as the location on where the oil is extracted. You see, much like coffee and other naturally occurring commodities, the quality and the properties of the oil varies widely depending on the location and where the oil is drilled from, like how well it can be refined, the amount of sulfur content it has, and the location, all of which dictate the price that we pay for that certain barrel of oil. There are mainly two exchanges on which oil is sold in the world. Most of the world's oil is traded on the Brentwood price. Essentially, if it can be shipped offshore, it can be traded in the Brentwood oil market. Also, there's West Texas Intermediate, also known as WTI, which essentially counts for any oil that is drilled or shipped within the United States, or even some oil exported from Canada. Mainly because any oil that is shipped into the United States or produced within the country's border is forbidden for export due to a law passed in 1973 during the oil crisis to help conserve fuel for the nation. For example, Saudi oil, which is classified as one of the most valuable types, sweet light crude, often sells for the maximum price you see on most oil markets. And thanks to large pipelines and offshore capabilities of Saudi Arabia to export the oil quickly and efficiently, they can typically sell their oil for top dollar. As well, the buyer won't have to pay as much to have their oil shipped to the respective country. As you can see, when a commodity is sold, the buyer is largely responsible to arrange transport of the item. The more expensive or difficult it is to actually extract the oil and have it shipped to any specific market lowers its value on the market, as they can often pay another seller more per barrel but save on shipping costs, making their total cost lower. Another factor is simply that the oil itself, as I said earlier, many qualities of oil exist. Typically, the best type for refining into lucrative fuels like jet fuel, gasoline, and diesel is light oil, as it flows easily, weighs less, and contains more of the profitable fuels dissolved inside, while heavier oils are thicker and harder to transport and are typically harder to refine as they contain thicker composites, which are less profitable like heating oil and thicker fuels like diesel and tar. Both of these factors taken together can easily describe the price of oil originating from almost every place on Earth. It's also why not all oil is profitable to drill, especially for certain countries and companies depending on where it's from. In regards to Canada, Canadian oil is both hard to extract, transport, and sell. A deadly triangle which only spells low prices for Canadian oil, but high mining costs and also higher refining costs, leading to minimal profit for producers. Canada's oil is largely sold in two different markets, Canada and the US. And since Canada's oil market is almost non-existent as most of it is consumed within the country, it does not trade like any other oil on any other market. It's effectively an extension of the WTI price, since the bulk of our oil is shipped to Cushing, Oklahoma, where it's held in transport and stored before being sold on the WTI market. This effectively means we have one buyer for all of our oil. And as we know, when you have one customer, that one customer dictates the price, of which Canadian bitumen typically sells for $10 below the average WTI price, mainly due to the overcapacity on railroads and shipping in the oil and the ongoing disputes with Keystone XL, which again further reduces the ability to deliver Canadian oil. Now that we understand how oil is bought and sold, This still doesn't answer why Canadians pay so much more for fuel when our own oil sells for even less on global markets. Well, the reason behind this is just like oil, refined fuels are also sold like any other commodity in the exact same way. Because there's such a huge difference between the types of fuels extracted from oil and their different uses and consumption profiles throughout the economy, they will always be dictated at a different price. For example, kerosene, used commonly as lamp fuel and even heating oil, is the exact same fuel used in jets, and of course the difference in quality regulates the amount of energy in the fuel per liter or kilo, as well as the flash point, the burning profile of the fuel, as well as any impurities or dissolved substances in the fuel itself. This is why kerosene is sold cheaply, but the highest quality kerosene like RP1 used in rocket fuel actually sells for much more. Of course, requiring different qualities and quantities dictates a different price for each. This is obviously an incredibly complex and expensive market to mature, so unlike customers in the US and international customers like many countries do not have the ability to refine their own oil and largely ship in fuel already refined for consumption. This means that even oil that is produced in Canada, refined in Canada, never leaving the country, will still be bought and sold on the world price for that particular fuel. Usually priced in US dollars, with the Canadian dollar hovering around 80 cents US. This explains why, as Canadians, we essentially pay 20% more to get the same amount of fuel that an American does, not even factoring any other cost valuations. However, this is still only part of the reason why we pay so much more. Another big part is most Canadian gas stations you may visit are what we call vertically integrated, meaning the same company who owns the gas station will most likely be the same company who refines the oil and also digs it out of the ground. From raw resource to the gas tanks of consumers across the country, Husky, Imperial Oil, and Shell are excellent examples of a giant oil company owning their entire supply chain and therefore being able to dictate the price, and due to a lack of variety in smaller independent gas stations, all of which price their gasoline in proportionally to the global market of gasoline, can effectively charge Canadians 5 to 10% more in Canada than they can get away with in the United States, especially since fuel is what we call an inelastic demand item, meaning people almost always have no choice but to pay whatever the price for fuel is, as it's so necessary that the demand for fuel will never decrease. However, even subtracting this increase will still be nowhere near what Americans pay today. Adjusted for a liter of fuel in Canadian dollars, the average American pays about $2.20 per gallon of fuel. Converting Canadian dollars per liter, this equates to just 70 cents per liter, still far lower than gasoline sold anywhere in Canada. A small footnote is that in the US, the infrastructure for fuel and delivering fuel is enormously efficient, as delivering fuel for over 100 million cars creates enormous amounts of supply chains, pipelines, and various other infrastructure for delivering fuel so cheaply. There's simply so much consumption that despite ultra low fuel costs, companies can actually maintain these low prices through infrastructure pipelines and truck delivery networks and enormous refining capacities. This is where we come to the main and biggest difference in fuel prices: taxes. Almost a third of the price you pay for a liter of fuel is just taxes. Provincial, federal, and consumption taxes, depending on the province you live in, adding in new taxes added on the fuel such as HST added to the price of gasoline in Ontario, and even more recently the new carbon tax, we can easily see how much of our expensive fuel can be chalked up to expensive taxes, much like everything in our country. However, it's still unfair to compare fuel taxes here to the United States, as they're notoriously undertaxed, and this has led to a huge lack of tax revenue in dealing with many of the under-supported aging infrastructure projects like highways and bridges that were not able to be funded due to insanely low fuel taxes. This is the reason behind the vast and critical infrastructure plans being delayed across the country, as funding simply does not exist due to continued low federal fuel taxes that exist. Looking at Europe, the highest fuel costs in Europe is about 241 Canadian dollars per liter, while the lowest in Poland is still an expensive $1.48 Canadian dollars per liter. As much as we complain about the price of fuel, getting a better understanding of what makes the price of fuel we pay so high and exactly how our fuel is extracted and delivered to our gas tanks, we can paint a full and honest picture and squarely set the blame on those who are unfortunately charging us as Canadians, and take solace in our quite moderate prices compared to Europe, while not dealing with the short-sighted tax policies that has left much of the US with severely underfunded highways.